Gideon the Brave. When the Midianites invaded Israel and stole their cattle and crops, the Israelites were afraid. Instead of praying to God to save them, they prayed to false idols. But Gideon prayed to God. One day, Gideon was threshing wheat when God's angel suddenly appeared. "God is with you," said the angel. "He has chosen you to rescue Israel from the Midianites." "Me?" squeaked Gideon, his knees knocking together. "How can I? I'm too young and my tribe is too weak." "God has promised to help you," the angel reassured him, and then disappeared as suddenly as he'd come. That night, God told Gideon to destroy the altars and statues to the false gods, Baal and Asherah. So, while everyone was asleep, Gideon and his servants burnt them down. When the villagers awoke next day, they were furious and chased Gideon. But Gideon's father shouted to the villagers, "If these gods are real, let them take revenge on Gideon." Do you think a pile of stones and a wooden statue could do anything to Gideon? No, they could not. Then the villagers realised that Baal and Asherah were false gods, and Gideon's God was the one true God. From that moment on, Gideon became their leader. He sounded the trumpet, calling the tribesmen to help him chase the Midianites out of Israel. He sent messengers to all the surrounding tribes, and men came by the thousands to follow their new leader. But Gideon still felt nervous and wanted more proof that God had chosen him to rescue Israel. After all, the Midianites were powerful and fierce. "God," he prayed meekly, "please give me a sign that you're with me." He left a woolen sheepskin on the ground that night and prayed to God, "If you really have chosen me, then let the dew fall only on the wool and not on the ground." The next morning he was up bright and early. He went straight to the sheepskin. The ground round about was dry. He picked up the wool and it was wet. He squeezed the wool and filled a bowl full of water. The dew had fallen only on the sheepskin. God had chosen him. But he wanted to make extra sure, so that night he asked God to let the dew fall on the ground and not on the wool. And sure enough, the next morning the ground was wet with dew. But when Gideon picked up the sheepskin and squeezed as hard as he could, not one drop of water fell from the wool. Then he knew for certain that God had chosen him to rescue Israel. Gideon looked out over the thousands and thousands of men who had answered his call, and God said to him, "There are too many men here. Send those who are afraid home." So Gideon called the men together and told those who were afraid to go home to their families. More than half the men gathered their things and left Gideon with 10,000 men. And still God said, "There were too many men. Take them all down to the water," he said, "and keep back those men who scoop the water up and drink from their hands. They are the ones who will be always ready and on guard." So Gideon did just that and sent home all the men who knelt at the water to drink. And that left only 300 men with which to fight the mighty Midianite armies. But Gideon trusted God. That night, God commanded Gideon to attack the Midianite camp and promised him victory. So Gideon and his servants sneaked up to the edge of the Midianite camp in the dark to spy. They overheard the soldiers talking in frightened voices. "Abdul's had a dream. It means that Gideon's army is going to defeat our army." Gideon knew the time was right to attack. He returned to his camp and woke his men. "Get up," he bellowed at the top of his voice. "We're going to attack." The soldiers rubbed their eyes and crawled sleepily from their tents, but they were soon assembled. Gideon divided them into 3 groups and gave each soldier a trumpet like a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch inside. Then he told them of his plan. They crawled up to the edge of the Midianite camp. One group went to the right side and one to the left side, and Gideon's group stayed at the back. The enemy camp was quiet and still. Everyone was fast asleep. At Gideon's signal, his men blew the trumpets and smashed the jars so that the sky was lit by the flaming torches and filled with the noise of the trumpets and shouting. The Midianites were taken completely by surprise. They ran out of their tents and collided with each other, falling over each other as they searched for their swords. It seemed like the whole army was surrounded by thousands of Gideon's men. The Midianites were filled with terror and fled in panic and confusion, and Gideon's men chased them across the border and out of Israel. God had kept his promise and given Gideon and Israel victory. And Gideon knew he could trust God to help him in all things. So he called together all the Israelite armies and continued to chase the Midianite armies out of Israel. And he was known for his bravery and strength, which he got from God. This story can be found in the book of Judges, chapters 6 and 7.